feel if you want to live where there aren't predators, why you need to move to New Zealand, I guess. That's the way we feel it. But you live in bear country, you have to learn to deal with the bears.
I feel the bears have a right to be here. We interact with them with no problems at all, and they don't create a headache. Once in a while you'll get one that's a little pain, but you can learn to live with him and share the land with him.
Despite how we say that we are more and more comfortable with the bear, we aren't comfortable with our children off in the brush in the summertime.
Your life could be really endangered. And if they wanted to kill you, they'll kill you instant. I mean, they're faster and bigger than anything you've ever seen.
Animals aren't dying right and left from these bears, and people aren't dying right and left. You know, they're around and you need to be careful, but it doesn't have to be a horrifying experience.
Grizzly bears have lived in North America for thousands of years, coexisting with Native Americans and occurring as far south as central Mexico in all but the most inhospitable deserts. When Lewis and Clark made their historic journey in 1802, there were an estimated 50 to 100,000 grizzly bears in what is now the lower 48 states. But modern societies and grizzlies have not had a comfortable relationship. As the human population has grown over the past 2 centuries, grizzly populations have plummeted. Experts estimate that there are fewer than 1,200 bears in the lower 48 states and a few isolated wild areas in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and Washington. That's a reduction in range and numbers of 98% over 200 years. Recognizing that lower 48 grizzly bear populations were in serious trouble, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service protected grizzlies under the Endangered Species Act in 1975. 8 years later, the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee, the IGBC, was established and given the goal of recovering the grizzly bear population in the lower 48 states. In the northern Rocky Mountains, legal protection has allowed grizzly bears to slowly expand their range and recolonize habitats where they haven't been seen in decades, increasing the potential for conflicts with people like ranchers.
Certainly there is an impact to ranching from grizzly bears, and issues of livestock depredation, issues of concerns or changes in management policy to avoid livestock depredations are issues.
Federal officials responsible for grizzly bear recovery and subsequent removal from the endangered species list are hoping that lessons learned in the Rockies can be successfully applied to other areas like Washington's North Cascades, where a handful of grizzlies walk the knife edge of extinction. Wayne Caseworm is a federal bear biologist and a member of the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee.
The Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee is a collection of managers, both at the state and federal level, that have dealings with grizzly bears and grizzly bear recovery. And for instance, just a few of those agencies would include the U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the states of Washington, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. They're all represented. on the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee, as well as the Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management.
The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service identified 6 ecosystems in 4 states with an adequate amount of good quality habitat for grizzly bear recovery. The North Cascades ecosystem is one of those areas. Research has shown that ample space and naturally occurring food can be found here, including more than 100 plant species that are part of the grizzly bear's diet. Now, though, only an estimated 5 to 20 or so bears remain in Washington's North Cascades. The Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee ultimately hopes to see the population expand to between 200 and 400. But the grizzly bear's very slow reproductive rate and the complex legal aspects of recovery mean that this process will take many decades, perhaps up to 100 years.
Ecologically, it does seem like the North Cascades are probably capable of supporting a healthy population of bears. They have in the past. There are measures in place that would protect and promote habitat in the North Cascades, and it seems like that would be a logical place for us to try and recover grizzly bears.
Will an increasing bear population and the management and protections initiated for them affect the quality of life for humans in the North Cascades, and will grizzly bears negatively impact ranching here? Perhaps we can answer this question by examining another ecosystem where, with federal protection for the last quarter of a century, bears are once again extending their range into the prairies, and cattle and ranchers are trying to cope. Mike Madel is a bear management biologist with the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks.
In Montana, we have grizzly bears that extend way out onto open prairie grassland, and one of our primary conflicts are dealing with bears that are out into open, low-elevation private land, coming into conflict with either livestock or ranch homes.
Part of that job includes meeting with ranchers to provide them with information about the bears.
People are often really surprised that the bears feed primarily on vegetation and that nearly 90% of their diet is feeding on plant foods of some sort of another. They graze on grasses and sedges in the spring, and then they often will turn to the high country in the summer months to dig for the roots of biscuit root and glacier lily. Then in the fall, a lot of times they'll get into these berry producing shrub fields. They may be chokecherry or serviceberry. They could also be thorny buffalo berry, but bears will often concentrate on these high sugar carbohydrate berries during the fall months.
So if bears are mainly vegetarian, why do they have a reputation as livestock predators? In addition to inaccurate rumors and folklore, Madel feels that grizzly bears have this reputation because bears, although principally vegetarian, will also feed on dead animals.
Historically, grizzly bears use the open rolling grasslands and extended way out, clear out to the Black Hills and almost to the Mississippi that we know of. And at that time there were hundreds of thousands of buffalo, elk, and mule deer in these environments. And they crossed these large rivers, and that we know that there was a lot of death loss due to drownings in these rivers. And there are historical accounts of bears feeding on buffalo and elk carrion at that time. And at that time it was very abundant, undoubtedly.
But what about live animals in particular? What about cattle?
The risk that cattle in particular suffer from grizzly bear predation is very low. In fact, we have a lot more natural mortalities that occur during the calving season, weather-related and even lightning strikes, than we do cattle depredations across this entire Rocky Mountain Front region.
Wayne Caseworm feels that these low levels of livestock losses to grizzly bears will also be the case in the North Cascades.
We would expect to see approximately 4 to 8 cattle and 5 to 50 sheep per year lost to grizzly bears at a fully recovered population, and that would be at levels of possibly 200 to 300 bears. In the Cascades, early in the process, where maybe we're only talking about a few bears, numbers would be expected to be dramatically lower.
The The landowners here in Montana have seen the grizzly bear population increase over the last 15 years, so they have a pretty good idea of what it takes to successfully coexist with bears. So do they also feel that the bears are not a significant contributing factor to cattle mortality?
If a guy loses 1 or 2 calves a year to a grizzly bear, I don't think it's a big deal. We've lost in the past to the one that my dad tracked down and killed back in the 50s. And since then, we haven't lost any livestock to bears. We haven't had any problem with them.
Terry and Carl Rappold run about 450 head of cattle on 12,000 acres, most of which has been in Carl's family for over 150 years.
They roam in and out of the cattle. In fact, we've got a couple of them that come in and eat the mineral out of the cattle tubs right along with the cattle while the cattle are standing there at the mineral grounds eating, and these 2 old bears will come in and help themselves to the mineral as well as the cows do.
Why do bears not kill the cows?
I think the size of the cow has a lot to do with the reason the bear doesn't take it. But a bear is not what you would consider a true hunter. They prefer to scrounge more than they do to take an animal down to kill it and eat it. They'd prefer rotten meat over fresh meat.
I don't really feel very pressured by wildlife. We have a lot of coyotes. I'd say, if anything, coyotes are probably the biggest concern just because of the numbers of them.
Susan Anderson operates a 1,500-acre cattle ranch with about 200 head. Her dad bought this place in the 60s. She sees bears on her property most often during calving.
We see grizzly bears fairly often in early spring, just as soon as they come out and get down here. You have loss during calving, and you've got your dead calf carcasses, and there's bears that know where they're at. They just seem to make a beeline to them, and they'll stay till they're gone. You know, depends on how bad of a year you've had.
The main issue is keeping bears from human sources of food. One of Montana's successful management programs is aimed at working with ranchers to move dead livestock away from buildings and into more remote areas.
You know, working with the ranchers to phase out livestock boneyards has really helped immensely to reduce the number of grizzly bear conflicts, particularly those in the spring when livestock carrying is most readily available. And so in most cases, the grizzlies that were down there feeding in those boneyards in the earlier years are now up along the foothill zone in remote areas feeding on livestock carrion and not becoming habituated and not causing trouble with ranchers.
Occasionally, rogue bears do kill livestock. Tim, too, has been ranching in bear country for years, but the spring of 2001 was particularly difficult.
We got a pretty good spring snowstorm where we got a couple feet of snow. And we don't calve till about 1st of April, and this was in April. And all of a sudden we had 2 grizzly bears and a black bear in the cows all the time. You were seeing tracks of them, but we always see that. But then they started killing, and the big grizzly bear, he was killing, and the other 2 were cleaning up. And within about a week's time, they'd killed 14 to 17 calves, just baby calves, day-old calves.
9 of these calves were verified killed by bears. The rest died from exposure and were fed upon by grizzly bears. Fortunately, this type of activity is rare. The offending bear was removed, and the following year, Tim lost no calves to grizzly bears. In Montana and Idaho, Defenders of Wildlife has instituted a program to compensate ranchers for livestock that is lost to grizzly bear predation. Minette Johnson works with Mike Madel to prevent ranchers from suffering financially when bears kill their livestock.
This is the basin.
If a rancher finds that livestock has been killed on his property, he contacts a wildlife biologist. They verify the cause of death. If it is a grizzly bear, they send me an investigative report, and I contact the rancher and try to get them a check within 2 weeks.
In addition to compensation for livestock loss, Defenders of Wildlife also has funds to prevent conflicts between bears and humans.
We've paid for a whole host of different approaches to prevent conflicts between grizzly bears and livestock. We've paid to put up electric fencing around calving grounds, around sheep bedding grounds. We've fenced bee yards. We've also purchased livestock guarding dogs for ranchers or paid for aversive conditioning of the bears by Karelian bear dogs.
One of the beneficiaries of the Defenders of Wildlife's Predator Fund are John and Leanne Hain. They have a sheep operation near Depouillier, Montana.
When we first started raising sheep, it was not with the intention of raising sheep in grizzly bear country. I mean, that wasn't an issue. We didn't have bears down this far from the mountains at that time. Then when they began to arrive, we were terrified. We'd watched Night of the Grizzly, we had read books, horror stories, bears knocking towers down.
Grizzly bears in books and in movies are often inaccurately portrayed as vicious predators, and it's this image that seems to stick in our minds.
And our first reaction was fear. Fear for our children, our livestock, our way of life. As the years went by, we began to realize that a grizzly bear is a huge eating machine whose main focus is finding something to eat and not necessarily the things we thought. We thought they were actual red meat predators that were out to get us. It's evolved into a relationship with them in which we really kind of wish they weren't here, but this is really nice wildlife habitat. In fact, John and his father basically have about 1,000 acres of this land in wildlife habitat. You can't have one form of wildlife without another. It just, you can't be selective. It all comes, and when the bears came, they're part of the big picture.
Everyone agrees that sheep are more at risk from bears than cattle. When the bears began visiting the Haines Ranch, they sought help from various agencies to somehow protect their 500 sheep. It was determined that electric fencing was the most viable security tool they could employ. So the state of Montana and Defenders of Wildlife cost-shared to provide the fencing systems.
Oh, without the electric fence, I don't think we'd raise sheep even. I think, if you figure out how to use it, it works. Almost 100%, with slight failures, but it really does work well for bears. They're really smart and they don't want to get shocked time after time.
Both John and Leanne grew up near here, and when they married, they built their own home along the creek that both of them played in as kids. They're cautious but realistic about their new bear neighbors.
Actually, I think the level of threat of a grizzly bear to a human is pretty minimal. I mean, I don't feel that they're stalking me. I don't think they're looking for me. I think they're trying to avoid me.
In fact, the threat to humans from grizzly bears is far less than the media would have you believe, but attacks do occur. In the lower 48 states, a total of 18 people were killed by grizzly bears in the past 100 years. In comparison, domestic dogs kill 18 people every year in the USA.
I haven't heard of anybody around here that's had to defend themselves from a bear, realistically. I don't know of any bear attacks locally. Lately, there has been some clear back in the 40s and the very early 50s, and that was induced when it was a guy that owned a band of sheep, shot the bear and wounded it, and the bear turned on him and tore him up.
To minimize bear encounters, ranchers can initiate a number of preventive actions, like moving dead livestock away from buildings and calving grounds. Some practices have proven very successful in keeping bears far away. People who don't pay attention to preventive advice are more likely to find bears in their yard. Again, Tim too.
Well, about a year ago, well, we still do, but we have this cow cake actually, and it's a sweet molasses feed. And it's just bulk in a kind of a grain bin down here. It's a wooden grain bin. And of course it puts off that molasses smell, and about a year ago we had a pretty big grizzly bear came in here 2 nights in a row and just ripped the door right off the shed. And he got in there and ate those pellets. And he was pretty neat though. He didn't make any messes. He just ate what he wanted and would be gone in the morning. He'd put the door back on and he'd tear it off the next night. But he didn't hurt anything. We did set a trap there. We never did catch that bear. When the trap got set there, why, he disappeared.
There's really many things that the ranchers and landowners in an agricultural area like this can do to avoid having conflicts. And those go from all the way from just simply making sure that your garbage isn't available to grizzly bears, to moving your calving operation in the spring off and away from a river bottom habitat into a more dryland environment so that bears aren't passing through calving grounds. And we've used electric fences now for several years, both to deter grizzly bears and to repel them from attractants.
Still, the occasional rogue bear can be persistent and cause damage or even loss. When this situation occurs, other action can be taken by authorities. In Montana, a bear can be relocated away from ranches.
You cannot move a grizzly bear far enough within an ecosystem to preclude it from returning again to its home range. And so in most cases, when we use relocation as a tool, it's used to move the bear temporarily away from the conflict site and as a form of aversive conditioning. Despite what many people think, actually capturing and handling that bear is a form of aversive conditioning.
The North Cascades grizzly bear ecosystem is just about the same size as the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. That's about 10,000 square miles. It's thought that both ecosystems could eventually support around the same number of grizzly bears. But experts have projected that it will take up to 100 years to see a recovered population of 200 to 400 grizzly bears in the North Cascades. And remember, there are only an estimated 5 to 20 there now, with no immediate plans to add to that number. In the meantime, it's not at all too soon for ranchers to begin taking proactive action, especially as most preventive steps are relevant for the more common black bear, too.
People can learn to get along with bears as well as bears with people, but it has to be, everybody has to be diligent. I mean, you cannot just blunder your way through their world doing whatever you want. I mean, you have to keep your garbage out of your yard. You have to do a lot of things like that.
The people are supposed to be the intelligent ones, so we have to take the initiative to learn to live with the bears. They don't have to learn to live with us. This was their country.
Anyone can live with bears if they will meet the management people halfway and say, yes, I will do these things. If you really, you have to cooperate. You have to get along, work together, and it can be done.
I don't really feel the grizzly bears are that dangerous. I think most times they knew you were there before you knew they were there, and they disappeared.
The ranchers in this program and others whom we spoke with in Montana were unanimous in their belief that although the grizzly bear population had increased, bears did not pose a serious threat to any operation that took the necessary precautions, including monitoring calving operations, calving as early in the year as possible, storing feed in bear-resistant containers, removing garbage, using electric fencing to deter bears, avoiding surprise encounters with bears, and removing dead piles. Both federal and state authorities will take lead roles in Washington to help ranchers coexist with grizzly bears.
I believe that grizzly bears are a tremendous indicator to the health of the environment and health of an ecosystem. And to be able to see wild, free-roaming grizzly bears in an area like this where you've got tremendous ranch lands, a lot of it's private land, and allow bears to exist in harmony really with a ranching community is tremendous.